welcome, and I will hand over to Lydia to introduce our speaker today. And thanks again, everybody, for joining.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to this event. My name is Lydia Curlis. I'm a first-year Ph.D. student at the University of Maryland College of Information Studies, or as we like to call it, the iSchool. Along with many of the other folks on the call here today, I am a student associated with the Center for Archival Futures, or CAFE, as we colloquially call it. This is a relatively new iSchool center, which started up in January of I think last year. There we go. I was taking script from somewhere else, but here we go. Basically, the purpose of CAFE is to bring together a group of interdisciplinary researchers from the iSchool and beyond the iSchool, whose work intersects at archives and digital curation, and this is very broadly conceived. We're interested in looking at the systems, processes, and institutions that care for and enable the use of digital objects and data over time. The various projects that fall under CAFE's umbrella take a wide range of human-centered approaches to understanding topics, including data and communities, knowledge ecosystems, and the life cycles of data. One aspect of this work is the speaker series, which is our flagship event, and is usually held on the first Wednesday of each month during the semester. We host speakers who are at the cutting edge of archives and digital curation research and practice in a wide variety of institutions, and you can find out more about these and recordings of previous events on the CAFE page, which Victoria shared just moments ago. It is now my pleasure to welcome our first speaker of the spring semester, Dr. Travis Wagner. Welcome, Travis. Travis received their PhD in Information Science from the University of South Carolina's School of Information Science this past December. Their primary research interests include critical information studies, queer archives, and advocacy in sociotechnical systems. Their recent publications include articles in the Journal of Information Science and the Journal of American Medical Informatics Association. They are also a co-creator of the Queer Cola Oral History and Digital Archive. They have authored and co-authored a number of publications, including Why Are the Bathrooms Inclusive If the Stacks Exclude? Systematic Exclusion of Trans and Gender Nonconforming People in Post-Trump Academic Librarianship, The World Real is No Longer Real, Deepfakes, Gender and the Challenges of AI-Altered Video, and Defining Community Archives Within Rural South Carolina. Their talk today, Body-Oriented Cataloging and the Future of Gender in Archives, describes Travis's dissertation research, focused on archival description and cataloging as cornerstones of information access at cultural heritage institutions. This work looks at the ways approaches can be messy and at times fail to represent the complexity of human identity, particularly when it comes to gender identity. This talk focuses on reflections on practicing catalogers as they make sense of naming gender as a socially constructed identity. Rather than give everyone here a list of best practices to follow, this talk instead aims to see the role of catalogers in these spaces as they play an active role in queer embodiment in archives. So without further ado, I will introduce Travis.
Great, thank you so much for that introduction, Lydia. I forgot that I said what I was going to do, but I still have slides to remind everybody of that. But I'm going to go ahead and set everything up. I'm assuming, unless somebody yells at me, that you can see my slides. But I first off want to thank CAFE for letting me sort of participate in the speaker series, and I'm really excited to talk about this research today. So I'm going to focus on what is being called body-oriented cataloging and the future of gender in archives. So in order to do that, I'm going to start by exploring an example of gender as it is a complex archival encounter before sort of thinking about current trends of describing that type of information and sort of how it relates to larger criticisms of information organization. Somewhere along the lines, I'll unpack gender as a concept. I'm assuming if you showed up here, I don't need to do that, but we'll sort of spend a little bit of time doing that. And then think about, that role of the cataloger in that process. And particularly, I'll utilize my dissertation research to sort of explore what their role of sort of describing gender is in that, and think about their cataloger's judgment, as is often called in the field, or the positionality in this work. And what I'll sort of try to build towards, and I'm hoping this is more a dialogue at the end, is what would be a body-oriented method for gender description and cataloging. all the while understanding that this is going to impact larger information and communication technologies, which I think is worth thinking about as a larger eventual archival issue. So what I want to do before I do that, though, is offer a warning. First off, as you might imagine, there's going to be some terminology in this presentation which is outdated. We're talking about identities whose names have changed, so you will see visual references to those things. I will do my best not to sort of verbally reaffirm them, but I do want to offer that warning. The second point was just raised. I am not going to give you a right way to do this because I don't think we figured out a right way to do this on a sort of social level, but sort of talk through the latent challenges in it, how we might think about doing this issue. So what I'll do is sort of start with a piece of footage for us to watch. It doesn't have sound, so don't worry if no volume is going on, but I'm just going to play it for the next 3 or so minutes. So I'll go and stop the footage there and enter back into the presentation. So questions that sort of come after viewing that, right? If we have no context as to what we're doing, is how we might think about what is going on in the footage and what information might make it into a catalog record. And I offer you this image because it is very much something that exists in an archive. This is from the Fox Movietone Newsreel collection at the University of South Carolina's Moving Image Research Collections. And for some time, this is more or less what the description looked like. I'll sort of let you read through it. It's from the 1920s. If you need that temporal bounding around it, you can note the subject headings, right? You sort of see a particular use of something like gender in this current context. And it's not ideal, I would argue, because it sort of understands something complex is going on, but doesn't necessarily handle it the best of ways. And And it would be easy for us to say, this is bad, this is a bad job. But what I want to argue is that we're facing a problem that's bigger than a catalog record, and we have to sort of step away and think about that bigger problem first. And that's because when we see footage like this, it challenges an assumption about when and where such things were possible in history, and if so, what we do with them, right? And how we describe those types of things. And it's also always keenly aware that for this to show up in that moment of time was to understand it was doing so against a larger social system that made it very difficult to do. So this is the dope sheet from this particular piece of footage. And it sort of was what the camera operators would describe they were shooting. Most of it is just, hey, here's what we are putting our camera in front of, here's the shots we were doing. But scene 3, they sort of observed that, you know, while we were shooting this, the entire faculty was standing around to watch that the story was kept within limits, right? So the sort of expressions and explorations that were going on here were heavily regulated in some capacity. So theoretically, it's interesting that it's come forth this way. And what I want to argue before we sort of move forward is that if we're thinking about cataloging gender, it's not just a contemporary issue, right? It has as much to do with our sort of often inability to understand or imagine gender diversity as existing in the past, and whatever we mean gender diversity to be. And that's because we often treat it as a sort of asterisk idea, right? That there are exceptions to this broader sort of identity that happened, but you know, they are a minority occurrence, or they're incremental, and we don't need to readjust our sort of organizational standards to attend to them. So that's sort of one part of it, right? And that is being contemporarily and intensely challenged by a lot of scholars. I'm just sort of highlighting some folks who I think are doing some really radical work to sort of spread farther into the past a history of trans identity, and sort of folded into this as well, non-binary identity, right? By arguing that we have archival records that reconstitute and show us trans history. We just don't want to do the work of saying that the tale of history is longer than it is. Partially, this is because the sort of public acknowledgement of this probably did not happen in a sort of popular sense until somebody like Christine Jorgensen sort of emerged into tabloids, and her transition was very public, right? So people would say, that doesn't exist, I've never heard of it before, so it can't be real. And I'm hoping sort of convince you that it is, right? Here, pulling another sort of example from Fox Movie Tone newsreel of what might just be a drag performance, but what could also sort of contextualize gender non-binary or even trans histories if we think about this sort of broader model and this broader scope, right? But you know, there are challenges on top of these challenges, right? Gender is an expansive concept, right? There's lots of terms that overlap one another, that parallel one another, that have been used and have been taken out of lexicon, but they all sort of exist in conversation with one another. So sort of trying to figure out the right option can be difficult. And as I'm sure most folks in the room know, these things don't exist exclusive of things like sex and sexuality, which also become sort of complicated as we expand and shift these definitions as well. So that's part of the problem. But also, even if we sort of look to what scholarship and what sort of authorities say about this, not really a lot of agreement on that either, right? Sort of one of the sort of key examples, if we think about the footage we watched earlier, is a continued fight between, you know, is this a history of butch lesbianism, or can we sort of start calling this early examples of trans masculinity? And as you might imagine, oftentimes the sort of camps who argue for that refuse to yield the sort of rare opportunities of representation that they get. Somebody like Jack Halberstam might even go further and say, you know, it's also like a problem of how masculinity is sort of given and privileged to certain identities, and we can't even sort of unpack that issue. But again, it's also arguably about the sort of orientations and viewpoints of the people making this history. I want to draw your attention to Kate Summerscale's biography of Joe Carstairs. Carstairs was a really sort of famous socialite from Britain who was known for speedboat racing. In all of their journals, Carstairs very emphatically said, I am not a woman. I do not want to be called a woman. Do not refer to me as that. Yet when Summerscale sort of wrote this biography, this definitive history of Carstairs, she sort of said, well, Carstairs is just an eccentric lesbian, right? Sort of disavowed any attendance to what it would mean for Carstairs to say blatantly that I don't identify this way, right? Because partially not having the language there, but partially I would argue not seeing or not orienting themselves to that potential reading. So this then tells us something about the role of information professionals and archivists as mediaries for this, right? Because they are going to do but one of the ways in which things will get described, right? And how we think about this description becomes really challenging. Again, this was an older version of this record's description. It's since changed, and we'll talk about what it's changed to at the back end of the presentation, but this is sort of ascribing a certain way that we think about it and using certain terms, some of which are far out of fashion to do that descriptive work. So what we have to sort of take into account before we get into the cataloger's roles is that part of this is an organizational, information organization problem, right? Most of our sort of information organization standards are built on very sort of normative ideologies, right? I don't need to quote Sanford Berman to the room, sort of his pointing out on the way subject headings and information organization are incredibly exclusionary. But even more than that, it is an incredibly othering sort of approach to description, right? Hope Olson's work is really clear that, part of the problem is when we do have other identities emerge, it doesn't do anything to sort of decenter or normalize identity, right? The sort of famous examples being something like there's a subject heading for college teachers, and there's a subject heading for women college teachers, right? So you would assume that there would be a subject heading for men college teachers, but that's sort of the normalized identity in college teachers, right? It goes without saying, right? And it reproduces similar things around race, ability, things like that as well, right? So it again says this is an other thing within a normative framework. Even if we take it to sort of more descriptive practices until very recently, things like RDA only gave people a gender binary to choose from, sort of saying, well, these are the two ways you can describe a gender in an identity. And what I want to have you think about, right, is even at these sort of organizational standards tend to prioritize and center written word, right? It doesn't think about the way visual information deeply complicates this because visual information is sort of perceptively different in some ways. And that's all to say that there are ways of thinking about this across our field that are really important to what we're sort of going to do for the rest of the presentation, right? One way of thinking about it is we tend to describe things in either a document form or a domain form, right? Like what is the object? The object is a book, right? Well, books can do a lot of different things, right? The domain, what sort of field of thought does this fall into? We can describe it related to that. So, if we take something like gender studies, well, the domain of gender studies cuts across other domains, right? So it becomes very, very difficult in that capacity as well. We can think about it from Shatford Lane's model, right? We can look at objects for what they are of or what they are about, right? Sort of describing ofness and aboutness as two frameworks, and that gets us somewhere. But underlying this, right, is like a lot of the way we do that in gender description is assuming that sex and gender are the same thing. Again, I'm going to take liberties and assume that the room knows the distinctions between these two, right? But I will point out that oftentimes this idea of seeing gender is people seeing what they assume to be sex, and the things we use to define sex are often not visible, certainly not visible in the footage that we saw today, yet they sort of bound it by those things. And we can step even further, right, and sort of say, well, it still remains a problem of what's called the semantic gap, right? What sort of humans can understand and conceptualize versus what we can teach a computer to describe, right? And I would say gender very much exists in that gap, right? Although at the end of my presentation, I'll show that maybe not everyone's thinking that way, right? But if we take something like the way humans see as a way to frame it, even that only gives us so much to work with, right? Because it still assumes that we sort of perceive and share in experiences in similar ways. If you're a fan of 80s sci-fi movies like I am, and you've seen They Live, you know that that's not the case, right? In the movie, if you've seen it, Roddy Piper sort of gets these sunglasses that sort of reveal that his world's being sort of designed by aliens to sort of hide him from the sort of stark reality that they're being exploited, right? And what I want to argue is that we sort of have a similar way of seeing and thinking about gender. And often it does not allow us to see gender as a spectrum in our descriptive work, right? The sort of system in place in this particular context is something called cisnormativity. So cisnormativity being the idea that everyone you encounter in the world is cisgender, and that everything in the world should be designed and centered around that identity, and often not giving space or options to folks who do not identify that way, right? The most over-exhausted example of this would be like bathrooms, right? And then that has a sort of limited scope for analysis, right? But sort of understanding that there are two genders and there are only, in most cases, need for two bathrooms to reflect that, right? But in terms of larger informational systems, we see this all over the place, right? Patient intake forms, for example, in health information spaces, right? Requiring sex to be a sort of marker and then using that to sort of ascribe all sort of health-based needs. We see it in sort of ICT spaces as well, like dating apps, right? Which tend to have gender diverse options, yet they are under these sort of more or other or asterisk category, right? So this idea that, again, systems are designed and privilege certain identities mean that for the most part, folks don't have to think about or encounter this difference, and in turn don't have to think about its implication for sort of describing and making sense of the world. So what that means is that there suggests that even if we have expansive gendered language for cataloging, there's still a concern, about how catalogers perceive of and apply language to their records, right? So I gave you that sort of set of criticism. But criticism might, or sort of the information organizational systems might be but one part of the problem. And that's because if we look at LIS theory, we have ways of understanding our sort of relationships to information as a very embodied thing, right? So what I think about not only is the sort of individual relationship to cataloging, but the way things like cisnormativity impact that work, right? So we can look to embodied information practices in our field. We can look to queer theory to sort of start questioning that, right? So if we take like the Savalainen model of everyday information practices, where we have these routinized everyday ways of doing information, gendering and identifying gender can be one of those. But if we take somebody like Sarah Ahmed's sort of phenomenological approach to identity and sort of queer it, we can say that, if you have an identity that's not straight, that's not cisgender, sort of making sense of the world is always a sort of challenge. And what it tells us then is that like lived experiences inform how we identify ourselves, how we share that identity, and how we see identity in others, right? And oftentimes that can be counterintuitive to normative practices. And what we're seeing in LIS more and more is looking at these information practices and what they tell us about how, say, LGBTQ populations use health in different ways, or potentially how LGBTQ or queer populations use online spaces to create new worlds. Diana Flogel's work around fan fiction does a really great job, I think, of exploring this. But the question then becomes, and one that I wanted to think about was, can queer embodiment produce sort of queer potentiality within footage? So what that led me to do is sort of research with catalogers in particular. So what I did is I looked at 13 practicing catalogers. I did semi-structured interviews with them to sort of talk about their cataloging work and identification practices. And part of what I did was I asked them about I asked them to do a think aloud exercise. So I screened footage with them, including the footage I played at the beginning of this presentation, and asked them to describe it, right? Sort of talk about identity making, its value, and how they would catalog this, right? But along with that, I applied a sort of queer phenomenological lens to this work to sort of say, well, what is and isn't being said, right? What is being assumed as normative and what is going unspoken? And what I found in that work was that participants sort of knew that cataloging required acknowledging uncertainty, right? They're like, I can never know what I'm doing, but they were also very aware that, they had control and leverage over the long-term description of an item, and sort of this consistent notion that humans are really, really difficult to describe. But they would say, if I have context, it makes my job really, really easy. And if we take the summer scale example, sometimes context can be misleading, right? But perhaps not surprising to a lot of folks, is that a lot of folks relied on gender shorthand to do that description, right? Things like pronouns, sort of the roles of participants as being a man and a woman, or naming their gender identity became sort of ways of doing that work. Notable other things that happened where there was a sort of conflation of gender with sexuality, which might be understandable if we take the footage that we saw earlier. But what I want to call your attention to as well is that participants who identified as non-binary tended to consistently note their unwillingness to misgender or sort of picked up on gender non-conforming potentials within footage. There's also sort of an encounter with the gender non-conforming footage, which led a lot of participants to reevaluate their gendering practices as well. One of my participants, Osla, said, quote, "I was wrong and I shouldn't have assumed that. And I can't really tell. It's wedding footage, but I shouldn't have described it that way. So I need to be mindful of describing without identifying who they are." And before I sort of go into the implications for cataloging, what I want to tell you is that, this tells us something about sort of the queerness of a cataloger informing resource description, but it also tells us that queerness as a resource can inform cataloger perceptions, right? So this idea that it's sort of co-constitutive, if you will. But what does this tell us then about more inclusive cataloging of gender? And what does it tell us about the future of queer embodiment in archives? Well, first off, cataloging can be additive, right? So I always sort of like to highlight something like the Digital Transgender Archive, which works to sort of put overlays onto pre-existing collections to sort of say, well, this looks like it could be part of trans history, and sort of has this collective approach to describing it. Well, they'll take things and say, one way we might think about this is that it's trans. Now, they won't outright describe it as trans unless there's an affirmational statement, but it sort of gives ways to link that across things, right? So understanding you can have identities exist together, right? Particularly if there's infighting around those identities. So if we go back to somebody like Joe Carstairs, what we're seeing in sort of LGBTQ community spaces is just treating this as a doubly true statement, right? So for example, Kickstarter, there's recently an attempt for to sort of get a trans heiress musical for Carstairs, and you can just imagine sort of trans heiress in the way we understand Carstairs to be a conflicting identity, but it's saying, well, if we're building both of these histories together, it can be true. So that sort of creation is happening in spaces, right? But what I want to highlight too, right, is the descriptive information can come from outside of authoritative spaces as well. So what I would highlight here is that if we know that the sort of biographies that summer scales have, while useful, are limited in their scope, we can look to where else sort of trans affirmation, non-binary affirmation is happening. Unsurprising, perhaps a lot of it is happening in new media or ICT spaces, right? So here on a documentary about John Barry, who is a doctor, right, that we sort of now understand to be an early example of trans masculinity, but although again, the biographies sort of say, oh, it's just a woman who is cross-dressing, right? And if you look from the lens of sort of queer embodiment, you see a much different sort of history of, again, a person saying, I am not a woman, right? I am a man, and this is what I am doing, right? So this idea that it's not even a question of hiding or cross-dressing, but deliberately expressing masculinity, right? So sort of reconstituting those things as well. And I see a big fan of TikTok for all of the sort of concerns around it. I see a lot of this happening in TikTok spaces where trans history is being named and relabeled and sort of reconstituted in this way. I'm a big fan of Rainbow History class on TikTok. If folks haven't, I know your algorithm leads certain things to you, but if you haven't caught on to this, it's a really great sort of example of what this could look like and sort of the descriptive practices happening, say, in the hashtags to sort of imagine different ways of talking about this are really, really great. And the conversations that happen as well. But cataloging can, and I would argue should be, body oriented. So let's take the catalog record from earlier. I worked with Merck to sort of find us a way to talk about all of the things going on with it without literally saying the gender, right? Because we don't actually have affirmational statements about gender here. So we shifted it to, for now, college students hold a jazz wedding to depict the spirit of modern times. Participants dress up as both sides of the wedding party, the ceremony is performed, and the bride and groom kiss, dancing all the while. Scenes of bride dancing with the groom. Again, it is telling you what's going on, but it's arguably intentionally avoiding saying something is what it is, because again, while we might want to reclaim it as trans, we might not be able to, but we can talk about the way it's doing things with gender, and that's really, really important. Other things you might consider when doing this type of work, right, is you can utilize the performance of gender rather than gender as an identifier, right? Oslo, my participant, saying you can describe it without identifying, right? So you can talk about somebody expressing femininity, dressing masculine, right? We have sort of shorthand for that are useful, but if we don't have that term, then it's a different descriptive process, right? Think about your use of pronouns as shorthand in cataloging, sort of what that closes off, right? I'm thinking here particularly like relying on he or she in sort of descriptions of information, particularly photographs, moving images like that. But be cautious not to overwrite gender diverse identities, right? We don't want to reproduce the same problem that we are seeing Olson and others raise, right? It's like I'm only over fixating on saying, well, this looks like a trans identity, right? Because I think it's important that we sort of understand that, you know, if we're going to sort of explore this, we need to also account for how we assume things to be cisgender as well. Opening up records for community dialogue is really important. Things like crowdsourcing, I think, are getting us there. Also happy to report that there are pre-existing schemas that you can sort of fall back on. Big fan of the Homosaurus. And I think there's sort of massive differences, at least until recently, on how they deploy terms like drag versus something like the Library of Congress. And I know, to my knowledge, the Library of Congress has changed quite a few of these. So if there are folks in the room who can speak to that better, by all means, happy to hear from you, right? The idea, right, that you can talk about drag in a more thoughtful way if transgender identity or non-binary identity aren't the options. Also, I think sort of advocating for site-specific standards can be really important here by saying, you know, we're bound to larger sort of linked data systems, but there's nothing stopping us from, at an institutional level, saying specifically in our records, here's how we're going to talk about gender, right? And sort of normalizing that as a practice I think can be really important. And also sort of contextualizing positionality in cataloging work, right? Saying these are the sort of identities I bring to a record, and this is the sort of choices I make can be really generative. I think that's important for two reasons. First, it sort of combats this like misnomer of neutrality in our field that like catalogers can objectively describe things. Well, they can try, but you know, they're bringing in context, and my research certainly implies that there are choices being made that are predisposed to certain normative ideologies. But secondly, it also gives catalogers a way to sort of confirm their labor, right? Another thing I heard from participants is people don't know the amount of work I do. Allowing catalogers space to talk about this in records, I think, could help alleviate that, even if it does add a sort of additional layer of work. It says, here is the work I'm doing, right? And I think that's really important. But ultimately, it's about acknowledging the very human role required for gender description. And I say this here because part of what we might see happen if we don't think about this is that AI is going to do this for us. And AI is completely fine right now with just being like, gender is a bunch of physical traits that you can sort of describe things with, right? And that matters to me because there are certainly ways to crash this, right? I think there's some really amazing hackers doing sort of makeup tutorials on how to crash AI. But there's also sort of the way that we can use it to sort of queer the sort of relationship. Jake L's sort of work of sort of thinking about how you can deploy gender identities that subvert AI, right? Brings us back into the space to say that sort of whatever organizational systems we have, there are folks who are going to find ways to sort of counter them and exist outside of them. So that brings me to sort of my final point, which is whatever we decide to sort of do with the future of gender in archives, in cataloging, requires us ultimately to sort of understand that we have to better acknowledge and attend to the fact that we have assumed certain things about what we do with it in the past and sort of account for our inability to see what is already going on in front of us. So I'll go ahead and stop there. I thank you for listening, and I guess I'll open it up to questions.
Thank you so much, Travis. So if people have questions, you can either drop them in the chat and I can either call on you or I can call on you if you raise your hand. Paris? Or were you clapping, Paris?
I was just clapping.
Okay. Yeah,
Thanks.
so feel free to drop them in the chat or raise your hand and we'll call on you.
Oh, and Violet, and thanks for the Homosaurus link and for Victoria for Rainbow History class.
Hey, Travis. I have, so I've never heard of the Digital Transgender Archive before, and I am super keen to hop in, and you refer to it as an overlay, or like an attempt to kind of overlay some description on existing archives. Is that right?
Partially, yeah. They build new content, but what they will also do is sort of say, we will ingest sort of things and say that this is also, like, we will sort of help do descriptive work as well. Yeah.
So I'm wondering if their work is recognized, incorporated in any way by the institutions that they work on top of, or kind of what their broader impact has been, what success they've seen that way.
Yeah, that's a super fair question. And I will say they have done a really good job of building a couple of key collaborations with perhaps unsurprising archives, like the One Archive, right? I believe UCLA, right? By being like, oh, there's an obvious sort of tie-in, right? But they've also sort of highlighted some folks who have been doing like really community-driven archive work for decades. So, for example, they have almost all of J.D. Doyle's visual archives, and J.D. Doyle is a Houston-based queer archivist who's been sort of creating websites. It's like the 90s of just being like, oh, I'm going to skirt copyright and just upload all of these sort of drag PDFs that I can, right? So they've sort of stepped in and said, well, we see pre-existing things, right? So it's a combination of both identifying major stakeholders in this, right? With major collections. I know they're starting to work with, I think it's British Columbia that has the Transgender Archive as well, right? So identifying that. But I also know you can sort of contribute as well. So it's a little bit of a combination of those things. Yeah.
Is it open to contributors, or how do you? Yeah, it is.
Yeah. No, there's a, as you might imagine, a vetting process, right? But it's certainly open to contributors. They're very sort of dialogue based in that way, which I think is one of the things I tried to highlight, right? Is the importance of like that back and forth happening.
Yeah, that's great. I'd never heard of anyone doing that sort of kind of reparative overlay work at all. So actually that's opened up a whole new set of things for me to look into. That's great. Thank you.
I know there's some folks trying to do it for Indigenous populations. Shout out to Snack and folks, right?
Yeah. Oh, that's fair. Yeah, Snack, of course. Yeah.
I shout out to there's some other folks in like the moving image world. Jasmine Castro's work trying to do it for like African American home movie archives by sort of reconstituting what exists in collections. It's not a unique practice, but it's hard. It's often not visible in the same sort of way, right? Yeah. I can read if you all want me to. I think Finch has a question. I can go and read it unless you want to.
Violet had a question before that. I don't know if Violet, did you want to ask your question? Or do you want to just read the question?
I can read out what I said. So just wow, this is really great stuff. Thank you, Travis. So a question about your suggestion for identifying catalogers' positionality. Do you have thoughts about what that might look like in a bibliographic record or a finding aid? And do you know if people or institutions doing that work already?
I don't know about finding aids because finding aids sort of function a little differently in my mind, right? But I don't know of examples, but my thought in bibliographic record would be there tend to be fields where it's like contributor notes, right? Or field or metadata creator, right? Something like that, right? So operationalizing just an additional field that would say sort of, it could be part of like contributor notes by saying, you know, these identities inform this description. I used X, Y, and Z terms, right? And I know that that's not a sort of common practice, right? But again, I think we have a sort of larger hurdle of wanting to step away from objectivity, right? But Violet, I can certainly sort of dig into that more, and I'm happy to shout out to you on Twitter if I dig stuff up. That's a really great question of finding folks who are already doing it, right? So I'll get back to you on that for sure.
Yeah, I'd love to hear it. And I think that's a really good idea to use those fields that haven't been used very often. Thanks.
Yeah, of course.
And Finch, did you want to ask your question, or do you want us to just read it out?
Do you want to do it, Lydia?
Yeah, sure. So Finch said, thank you so much. I'm a library science and history student, and I'm often dismayed when I search for a term like trans or lesbian or cross-dresser doesn't return library catalog results. How do you think about the balance between not assigning identities to past people while also helping researchers find those records?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question, Finch. And one thing I would say is, two things. The first one would be, you can sort of incorporate terms like we might use these terms, right? I think if you preface it now, you could say this might be an early example of trans identity. This might be genderqueer. My hesitation with sort of committing to that, right, is I also know that there are things that like sort of scrub data and just pull transgender and be like, oh, well, this is, right? So there are sort of larger social technical systems that might make that really, really difficult. But what I will say for your particular research, right, is there's a likelihood that that content exists there. You're just going to have to use terms that you're going to feel real uncomfortable writing into a search box, right? I remember sort of teaching folks to find trans materials in the library, let alone an archive, and I'd be like, well, you're going to have to use a term that you know is wrong. And immediately, like, they put that term in, right? And they found everything they were looking for, but it was tagged in an outdated term, right? And what I've encouraged folks to do is when they find those problems or those hiccups in their collections, right, is usually this works, right, is email a librarian or somebody in charge of that collection, be like, hey, just so you know, this term's outdated. For example, the movie tone footage that I screened at the beginning, I messaged the curator and was like, hey, nobody's using that first term to describe anything in an archive anymore. And he was like, got it, we'll change it. And we noticed we also have this issue in other records as well. And they sort of mentioned, it's like, we're going to keep it in sort of some of the hidden metadata just so we know the evolution, right? Just to keep that record there. And then they were like, do you also have a suggestion for describing this, right? So this is your part as a researcher wanting to find this, to both find the terms that are being used historically while also offering alternatives, right? So you can say, I found it under, and I'll just say it for the sake of example, right? All of the stuff was under transsexual, right? Would you consider changing it to trans, right? And most times I find folks are willing to facilitate that.
Victoria, and then we'll get to Celeste's question in the chat.
Great, thank you so much, Travis. It's so exciting to hear about your work in more detail. I was wanting to circle back to something you just said about the keeping the metadata, but maybe not surfacing it. And I just wanted to check, is that still searchable in the sense that it might bring somebody to a record using an outdated term, but not show it once they get there?
My understanding is that it's searchable on a institution side, right? So they could say, we do know we've used these terms before. I don't know of cases, but there could be. I'm sure you could design it in such a way where it's still searchable, right? And I think it's more to just say, these are terms we've used in the past, right? Because one of the sort of concerns here, right, is like, if we take it away, that is like erasure of the sort of historical ways that terms were used. So I don't think so, but I also would have to sort of, again, double check on that. But my assumption is that you can search on an institutional side, but not necessarily on a user side, right?
Yeah, so that was my kind of historian's brain going off there, thinking like, well, if we take away terms that maybe people use to describe themselves or that were derogatory and that we don't use anymore, but they're still in the record. And I think particularly, you know, when things are now being OCR'd or transcribed and the full text becomes searchable sometimes within an institutional record, sort of how are we navigating that pathway? And my sense is that we need it sometimes to get there, but the layer of description that we do can be more up to date. Is that, yeah, okay.
And I would say that, like, there's a difference between like public facing and archive or institution facing metadata here, right? And what people see when they're searching versus what like yields that things are looking for can be where this happens, right? or like sort of context notes, right? Just being like, again, we're keeping this term for historical reasons. See this instead, right? And I think that's not a unique problem to archives, right? I can think of a lot of libraries that have like
Sorry, I think my screen froze for a second.
might have been.
I think actually it was Travis's end because I was having that too. So do you mind
Okay.
rewinding like
Yeah.
15 seconds just so we have it for the recording? Also the people who are here.
Yeah, I think I was the one who was lost for a second.
Yeah, do you remember what you just said like in the last 15 seconds?
Yeah, I was saying that there I was picking up somewhere about having sort of explanations for problematic terms, right? And this is another thing where it's just like contributor notes, notes field type thing, where it's just like, understand that we know, like if we're keeping this here, we know why we're keeping it here, right? Historical purposes, right? I think that says a lot, right? Versus just landing on a subject heading with no context, right? That's a way different thing. Yeah. And I was saying that it's not an archives unique problem, right? This is certainly true for any sort of library with collections that have been there a while.
Awesome. Celeste, would you like to ask your question, or do you want us to read it out?
I can ask the question. So thank you very much, Travis, for sharing this talk. It's been really interesting to hear about your research. I guess I was wondering, so I'm a current library MLIS student, and I was sort of wondering about how to communicate the nuance of this might be like an example of transmasculism or of transmasculine identity, for example, versus the very like sort of the definitive need of like identifying something with subject headings. For example, like I know that there wouldn't be a subject heading necessarily for like this might be transmasculine. It would just have to be transmasculine. So I guess where in a catalog record is the place for like communicating that potentiality or that nuance of like, we don't know for sure that this is what this is, but it's what it could be, while also making it accessible for like purposes and search results.
I'm gonna say the most sacrilege thing possible, right? Which is put it in the notes field, right? Which I know that doesn't solve the problem, right? But what I would say is that's a space where you can say, not necessarily here's how we came to this, but here are resources that we've been using to sort of guide our processes, right? What I will say Library of Congress has been better about in the past couple of years, which they weren't, is when they change all of the descriptive practices, they've added sort of mark fields, which are under the notes fields that say, we are using trans student educational resource as our sort of grounding point for description, right? So if somebody really wanted to ask questions, you could then say, well, here's what we're using, right? Because then it would be, again, about a dialogue, right? So it's in this context of nuance, it's more sort of dotting your I's and crossing your T's and just being ready if somebody has questions, right? Because I think users would be much more willing to have conversations about you saying it might be this than you being like, well, it's not this, or it is this, and there's no nuance, right? So yeah. Until the foreseeable future, it's the notes field, right?
Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
And Tony, do you want to ask your question? We can read it out. Okay, yeah, no problem. So with the heightened pressures on schools and school libraries right now, RE challenges and censorship, can you share some thoughts on to what extent your insights shared here may be getting lost and could be amplified in media coverage?
That's a great question. And I have two sort of divergent thoughts about this. One coming from the participants I interviewed and one from the research of folks who I know are in the room. The first one is that all of this work exists in the reality that archives and libraries are under the gaze of larger political systems, right? So I had at least one participant say to me very candidly, she's like, I will not do this description of my library because it will result in backlash that is not good, right? She worked at a small rural public library or small rural library, and she's like, and that backlash will come from my colleagues as well as the community, right? So all of this is sort of to say that like it's pretending like we don't have these larger systemic issues to attend with, right? And to give sort of teeth to that concern of a participant. I know Dr. Kitsey's in the room and she's done work with drag queen story times in the United States, right? And there have been instances of doing drag queen story time that have led to libraries losing funding, right? Because they become subject to political interests and the budget lines of their communities, right? And this is a real impact, right? So in some ways it gets lost in that dialogue, but also it is the sort of linchpin for this sort of discussion, right? Is like so much of the censorship is about sort of what happens at that record level, right? Yeah, and I see Doug has his hand up. I was waiting for a Doug question.
Yeah, so I've been grappling with how to make sense of this in a larger scale, and I think I finally come up with the example, which is is it Taiwan or is it Taipei, China? This is the same sort of an issue, right? Except that the one side of this is arguing that the other side should index it in a certain way. Or describe it in a certain way. And it seems to me the solution from our perspective professionally is just to say, there may not be just one description. You can describe it in your way and I can describe it in my way. And if I'm serving a group of users and you're serving a group of users, our users might have something they want to argue about and we might have political pressures on us, but we're not limited to a single way of doing this. By the technology. The technology admits multiple descriptions on objects.
I of course I agree. I would say that not to unpack the geopolitical stakes of Taipei versus Taiwan, right, which I am not an expert on doing, but here, right, with an understanding that like some of this has to do with like legitimizing identities that are constantly questioned for their legitimacy, right? But I do think it's a question of like, again, that's why I said one of the examples I gave is like it can be additive, right? There's no reason why it can't be additive, right? Yeah. So that would be my response to that very nice parallel.
Thank you.
Does anyone else have any questions? I know we're nearing 5. Oh, there we go. Josh, do you want to, is that a question or is that just a comment?
It's mostly a comment. I was just going to say that in the work that we're doing with Invisible Histories in the Deep South, like we're building in collection descriptions with our donor work. And so they fill out pretty extensive biographical forms, which are kept private in the project, but we allow them to help us describe the collections as they come in. And what it has allowed us to do is both give LIS students the opportunity to work with donors, but also these same people are helping us go back and look at pre-existing collections to help us nuance ways that we can take a collection from just saying like homosexual, like as a descriptor, to one that has way more entry points for people who are searching, especially because so many people don't really know or understand how archival research works. And so we're building Queer Southern collections with Queer Southern donors. And so eventually we'll have a nice sort of dictionary of terms that are applicable to the area in which we're collecting. So.
Yeah, no, I just want to say that the Invisible Histories project is amazing. I was sort of, before I came to CAFE, I was doing similar work in Columbia, South Carolina with their sort of historical society to sort of build an LGBTQ collection. And I just want to echo the sort of practice of being like, well, as you're building active collections, you can also use that community to recontextualize stuff. Because what we were finding is examples of, again, potentially trans folks in like the state newspaper from like the 1900s, right? Like trans women of color, which like if I had sort of told anyone in a room that there were trans women of color visible in Columbia, South Carolina in the early 20th century, I think we would collectively, based on our presumptions, imagine that impossible, right? So yeah, I just love the work y'all are doing and that echoing the exact statements you made, right? Especially the sort of praxis component.
Thank you, and thanks for your presentation.
All right, so we're coming up on 5. So if anyone has any last questions, feel free to just jump in.
Not to put you on the spot, Travis, so this is really a question for you, but also for anybody else in the room here. And I think picking up on a thread that Danielle mentioned in the first question and some of the work that Lydia and another member of CAFE, Diana Marsh, do with a snack group. Are there opportunities for sort of hackathon-like, description parties around this very particular set of terms and emerging discourse that you can recommend?
Yeah, I can, so I don't know of a hackathon example specifically, and I know sort of we've had dialogues about sort of creating that. I can sort of call your attention to something like the Trans Metadata Collective, which is a group of actively working librarians and information professionals who are creating standards. And they're in the process of being made right now, where I would sort of highlight some of the things, right? But they're asking these sort of questions saying, okay, at a practical level, what are we gonna do about this, right? In the very least, give you guidelines on the things to think about. So I don't know that they have a sort of website we can send out to yet, but Bree Watson, KJ Ross, and folks like that would be worth reaching out to. And you can Google both of their names and find a ton about them. Would be the folks to look at that. What I would say to your question about hackathons and sort of even potentially crowdsourcing, right, is it would have to be intentional to sort of involve the community, much like snack type work does. Because the reason I didn't offer crowdsourcing up as a solution in my dissertation was, at the time, all the sort of research about crowdsourcing said, unless it's community specific, it's probably going to reproduce some of the same sort of normative ideologies, right? So if you're interested in doing that type of stuff, think about it being sort of community focused, right? Or I think what folks call niche sourcing, right? Where it's sort of identity specific, right? But that's Victoria, you can probably speak to that better. So I'm gonna step away from that.
Thank you, Travis, so much. And Lydia, I will ask you to close it out in a moment, but before you do, I just wanted to share that on February 14th from 12 to 3 p.m. UMD through the iSchool is going to be hosting a Douglas Day Transcribe-a-thon event. So a satellite event that is taking part in a much larger celebration coordinated through friends and colleagues at Penn State and Howard and other universities around the country and indeed around the world, and other cultural heritage institutions. The information is going to be up and the registration will be up on our CAFE and main iSchool web pages in the coming days. And everybody is very, very warmly welcome to take part in our Transcribe-a-thon or indeed another Douglas Day hub near you. So thank you again, Travis, and over to you, Lydia, to close us out.
Perfect. So it is 5 o'clock now, and we're not going to hold you guys any longer. So I just want to say thank you to Travis for your awesome presentation today, and thank you all for attending. If you would like to attend future events, please check out our website, where we will be updating with all of the future CAFE happenings.
Thank you, everyone.